yeah, well, Susanne is a long friend of many of us here, actually, but I will say she's, I just want to mess it up. She is well, she's professor and head of research unit called Research Unit of Movement, Culture and Society in the Department of Sports Science and Clinical Biomechanics. Right, but I know Susanne very much because she's been working, I guess you would say you're an ethnographer, primarily, qualitative researcher, very much interested in the connection, link, relationship between qualitative research and phenomenology with the capital P as philosophical phenomenology, or perhaps not, maybe with a minority as well. Yeah. And you published a lot on the experience of sports practices, dance, and health-related topics. You yourself are an athlete, an Aikido supermaster, and tango dancer. So obviously your practice is very much informed by your experience as well. And you also, I have to say, you're behind a very successful course in qualitative methods that I have been very honored to be invited to, but for many years they covered at Southern, let's say University of Southern in Odense. They had this course for, was it just for postgraduate, but then you had researchers from all over the world at different levels, including lectures, who are really interested in this intersection between phenomenology and quantitative research. Yeah, and also I mentioned that you have got a grant from the Carlsberg Foundation. Yeah. So that is allowing you to live and write a book. Yeah. And you're gonna tell us more about your book, I gather. And so I leave the floor to you, but the title of your talk is really towards phenomenology of movement, praxis, dance, and
yeah. And this will also, that's a title that we don't publish, so that will be the title of the book. And I haven't changed it yet, but I mean, that might still come, but I think I will give it. And yes, I'm super thankful for the Carlsberg Foundation. I think I would like to add also that what I'm going to present this afternoon is also related to 4 months where I stayed at UCLA in Los Angeles, and that was funded with the Fulbright scholarship. So I was also sort of say thank you to Fulbright scholarship here in the beginning. So what I'm going to do is to let me see, was it? Oh, this way. Okay, so this is the outline for my talk. I'm going to talk about the concept of movement praxis, which is central for the book. What I mean by it and how it comes about, how it relates to my former work also. And then I'm going to tune in on embodiment and kinesthesis, phenomenological description of kinesthesis specifically, and how it supports the understanding of embodiment in phenomenological counts. And then I continue to ask, so how can we use that concept to analyze and understand how practitioners in different kinds of activities feel their movement? What is the relation? What is possibility here? And then it says concluding, and it is work in progress. So I'm still working on some concepts, so don't kill me, Joanna, if there's a concept where it's kind of, oh, that could have been, do you mean that or that? That is still in progress. Yes. So first part here about movement praxis. And yes, a lot, if you look at my, in my articles, I have performed different kinds of ethnographical field work in different kinds of activities. A lot of it is in different kinds of dance practices, both artistic dance, tango. It's also more sort of in between sports and dance, so it's very varied, my own opinion. And then I've also looked into martial arts practice alone or with students that have done some of the field work, and also sort of newer and also traditional sporting practices. So when I planned this book, I was trying to find a way of addressing these activities without saying dance and sports, because it becomes very sort of, what about the alternative sports, and how do I address that? It's a very wide concept of of dance that I work with. So I was looking for another concept, and I sort of went around to movement praxis. That is what I sort of have ended with for several reasons. But let me first say that when I talk about these different kinds of practices and look into them, what I'm really interested in is the cultivation of embodiment taking stake, because if you want to dance Argentinian tango, you enroll in a lot of workshops to learn what are these figures about. So there's a configuration here taking place. So it also means that when I address cultivation of embodiment, I address the skills, the sensorial differentiations, and interactive capability that are nursed and developed in the specific kind of practice. This is what it means to participate. I want to participate better, right? And furthermore, the perceptual attunement that the practitioners develop in their ways of perceiving certain facets of the situations in still more nuanced ways. There are several of descriptions that shows how being a capoeira practitioner, for example, break down his work, how we sort of start noticing different things, the sort of perception of the whole situation gets still more fine-grained. So that is what it is at stake here. Now, what I then mean by movement praxis, which I've already addressed, is to emphasize that the interactive dynamics of the movement activity that I'm looking at. And also to recognize that practitioners' engagement in and practice of the movement are vested with field-specific ideas and ideals of moving. And these ideas of what a body is, if you talk to an athlete, or if you talk to a dancer who are informed by somatic practices, these are not exactly the same. Also, the ideals of what I want to do and where I want to take it. I mean, that of course also goes into how they sort of work with this embodied cultivation and sort of attunement of perception. So I try to address that with movement praxis, and also acknowledge that when you are engaged in a movement praxis, you are sort of part of these interactive dynamics that is specific for a certain field. So I have a few examples. What does it mean in actual sort of, if you look into an analysis? So let's go with Argentinian tango first. We could talk about Argentinian tango as two are dancing together, and they're creating sort of the interaction through the embrace. The embrace is really important. There's a certain resistance in the embrace, and use that to create a torsion where you can lead and you can follow. So that is really sort of central to the interaction of the two dancing together. And this is from a sort of a milonga. Milonga addresses where tango is danced in Buenos Aires. Yes. Then, when you start dancing tango, you would also show up for these workshops to learn different kinds of figures. So you have a repertoire of figures that you would draw on when you dance together. The thing is here that you would improvise the dancing together with a partner. So it's not set how you use these figures. And that will always be enacted. And if I consider it a good dance, that would also be explored. So it's kind of, oh, I didn't know a bolero could be done this way with this dancer, with this music. Further, there is the music. Some dancers would prefer just to dance to the rhythm, and there's a huge agenda if it should be the rhythm or the melody, or to which degree the melody should be the way that is sort of decisive for how you dance, and to which degree you listen to the music. You're dancing, as you can see on the floor here, you're dancing with other couples. If it's a very crowded floor, there's certain things you can't do. If you're wearing high heels like that, you don't kick the legs behind you because you will hit somebody. And there's this, you dance tango, you know it, or you can just imagine, okay. But if it's a more open floor, you can swing the legs a little bit higher, for example, There are certain rules. If you dig into that, and if you hear the stories from people in Buenos Aires, if people doesn't follow, there are certain circles you have to be part of, and you have to accept that or respect that. And if you break that, you break the whole flow of the floor, and people can get really angry. So there's something at stake here. Depending, of course, on where it's danced. If you dance it in my hometown in Odense, these sort of ways of moving on the floor is kind of nearly absent. So it's a very different sort of interaction that is dynamic that is taking place on the floor here. And then there's, of course, when you dance on the floor, especially in Buenos Aires, you would, there'll be a lot of dancers sitting there waiting, just watching you dance. If you have danced, when you've danced 4 dances, there's a break and people go to the side and you invite other dancers. And there's all this nodding and all this taking place. So there are people sitting here watching you. So you're dancing to get dancers. You're dancing with your partner, you're dancing with the music, but you're also dancing to get dancers. So and that could be sort of described differently, as I already indicated. If I dance in Odense with people I know, there's a little more relaxed sort of atmosphere about getting dances. For example, there's floors, there's more space compared to if it's a sort of traditional milonga in Buenos Aires. So these interactive dynamics sort of shapes how you are aware of your body and how you invested in also the dancing. So that's what I mean by these interactive dynamics that shapes how you participate and engage. If we go to, you already mentioned Aikido practice, that's a Japanese martial art training, and it has a specific technique and approach. The idea is that you engage in sort of this martial art without harming the attacker. You try to merge with the energy that the attacker sort of goes with, and then sort of get them out of balance and then block them. That's kind of the idea. It's super short, right? The whole training is very, I would rather say differently. The Japanese apprenticeship learning tradition is really affects the whole idea of what is a dojo and how to relate to the sensei of the dojo. And there will always be a sensei of the dojo, even in Odense, Denmark. So, and this is my sensei, and he has another sensei. This is Dosho, who is the 3rd generation. So that is the highest person in this Japanese hierarchy. You would always refer to one higher. And he is the one who has the decisive sort of thing to say on what is the technique like. There's the whole thing about my sensei, Victor Maria, here being able to sitting next to him on a picture is nothing you ask him about just directly. You have to already have a connection to one who is closer to Dosho, who can then sort of ask for you if you are on the appropriate rank. So this whole thing goes into it. And this also loads the way that you are expected to show also and engage in a specific codes of conduct, which of course includes also bowing certain ways, sort of starting the practice by sitting on your knees in sesa and sort of showing your humbleness towards and your respect for the tradition. It goes into, this is me actually, practicing with a partner when you meet the partner and how you take turns in sort of exercising the techniques. And then there's, of course, the hakama, these are the black ones, and the gi that you're wearing. It's sort of very the belt is kind of very stable here, so it gives you a certain sense of your center. So when I move in the dojo, I would start moving differently compared to when I walk here. And if I have on high heels or tango, I would walk differently. So that does something, the clothes, and that also sort of informs my body and how I sort of move. So again, this is another example of sort of interactive dynamics that is sort of setting the whole movement practice, and it might sort of change depending on the exact day, the place, and so on. Yeah. You could say that, just to bring in a super short, 2 other examples, because you could say the 2 examples I just gave a little more notice here. They were partner-based, and they also included training. So what if you look into something where you just throw yourself into it? For example, the mosh pit in hardcore metal music. You go to a hardcore metal concert. I haven't joined that, but I'm on the side. My son is on. But I've talked to some of them, and I haven't sort of performed the research project yet. But you simply go out there and you just bump into people, and it looks like, big sort of, are they in a fight or what? But they are really strong ethical codes. Or if somebody falls, everybody will, some of you already. There's also something about if it's more wormsy, you would be more like this, and if you would be like that, and there are different styles. And if it's a person that's not as big as you wouldn't push them as hard. So it seems random, but there's a codex here. So it's still, part of the certain ideas and values and ways of behaving and handling that, even though it's a chaotic and it doesn't sort of come with training. There's something here. Again, these interactive dynamics, but a very different setting. And then Sheets-Johnstone, I just talked to some of the people who were here before. Just to take an example with a performer I worked with for over several years, interviewed several times. When she prepares her solo performances, she would go into the studio alone for 3 months, lock the door, nobody can join. And so you'd say, why are the interactive dynamics here? But when I interviewed Sheets-Johnstone, she would talk about energies and how she's in connection with it all. So it's not her just moving on her own, it's her connecting to different different energies. Talk to other dancers, they would talk about images. And so there's always this kind of interaction going on in different ways. So again, when I talk about movement praxis, I address the activities going on here and also say that there are different interactions and different levels of interactions taking place. What I'm doing in the book is to say, okay, I have all this kind of field work. I would like to bring it together or to synthesize these different kinds of field work and see if I can come up with at least a suggestion, at least contribute to a phonological framework for how we analyze these processes of enculturation and perceptual attunement. Yeah, I don't think this is about what I was thinking. Is this, can I move this a little bit? Okay, right. Yeah. So this is my background. This is just an overview to say this is some of the practices that I work with. The one in bold are the one where I did the field work myself, and these are some of the students I work with. These are some of the studies that I know will also somehow go into the consideration of movement praxis and developing this framework for analyzing movement praxis. And these are just to give an idea of how I work with the interdisciplinary integration of phenomenology and quantitative research is that I work with the ethnographical fieldwork according to ethnographical traditions. I know I'm specifically interested in experiences of movement. Of course, I know it. So that informs the ethnographical approach. And then I use different phonological concepts as they sort of make sense to the question in focus for the research project. And then I work with that in the analysis. And often in some analysis, it would be their phonological concept that helps me really emphasize, for example, for coaches, this is how you should handle non-injuring pain with middle distance runners. You should be aware of this way of thinking of skills. This is phenomenology informing the qualitative research output. But in other situations, it's also like I have a certain output, but the phonological accounts and concepts does not really go all the way. I have to push back and ask how could we broaden the phonological concept, maybe even in sometimes thinking of reconfiguring at least the way the concept is related to other concepts in the phonological discussions. And I mention this because I know there are different approaches to how you put phenomenology to use. So there are also more sort of applied methodologies where you say, I use this method, therefore it's phenomenology. So I want to emphasize that the way I work is with this integration of two disciplines, ethnographical fieldwork and phenomenology. It also means that when you look into my publication, and this is important for myself, is that I have publications in this is about bodily self-awareness. This is in the phenomenology and the cognitive science. So that's a discussion with other philosophers, where I collaborate with another philosopher, Dr. Lepant. And then we developed the understanding of how we can be aware of the body. And then in projects that follows, these were published in quantitative research, where we looked into, these were dancers, where we looked into runners, Tai Chi practitioners and here a golfer to see is the same kind of bodily self-awareness as a phonological sort of structure of experience. Can we see it at stake here? And what does it mean in different kinds of setting, different kinds of praxis? And so to bring further sort of understanding on how to, for example, work with middle distance runners and how they understand their skills. So it goes forth and back in that way. Okay, so this was an introduction to my work. Should be around the first 15 minutes, like about we planned, right? Okay, so I'll dig into one of the concepts now, kinesthesis. And I would say that when I now present, it's not like I take the case as I did in the article we just discussed in the hour before the setting. It's more like I draw on the amount of experience. I mean, the whole thing about movement praxis is recognizing the situatedness and these kind of interactive dynamics at stake in the praxis and say, okay, I know this is at stake. I can bring several examples, and now I want to sort of understand how I could bring kinesthesis, phonological understanding of kinesthesis to use when I want to sort of have a closer look at what does it mean when we talk about feeling movement. So, and before I continue, I just want to touch on perception super shortly to address that. When with the notion of perception, I mean, I follow Merleau-Ponty, and I mean our basic and primary communication with the world. So it also means that perception will be considered, in my analysis, considered before any sensory sort of specific attention. So to say, I really feel that, this kind of touching is all I focus on, then I will see perception as underlying that. And just remind that throughout his book, he several places, the phenomenology of perception, he several places emphasize that embodied movement inform our perceptual grasp on the world. So movement and perception are thought as very sort of connected, but it is perception which is in focus of his book. So it's kind of mentioned. I'll come back to that. So that's what I mean by perception. Now, I will then turn, if you look into here, I've primarily drawn from Zahavi's work from 2003. And his definition of kinesthesis as a sort of a specific kind of self-sensitivity. To quote him, kinesthesis is in that sense fundamental for our unthematic, pre-reflective, lived body awareness, which conditions and accompanies any subjective experience. So this is the short definition of it. What I will continue doing is to flesh some of this understanding and some of these accounts out by looking into Zahavi's newer edition from 2020, Self-Awareness and Enterity, and also Yona Teichler's Phenomenology and Embodiment from 2014, their description of kinesthesis in their account of embodiment, and see, can I use this? So what they do in their description is also to emphasize kinesthesis as having a constitutive role for the functioning body, for being this lived body in the world. And now I just need to figure out, somebody has switched my papers, so now interesting. Yeah, okay. That was interesting. Yeah, here we are. Good, thank you. So it's a central point, beginning point in these works to indicate that to have perceptions of objects, others, and the environment, and in that sense to be a situated and perceiving subject, presupposes this fundamental pre-reflected sense of self-awareness, which is given through kinesthetic experiencing. And they sort of, you could then add that on several occasions, especially Zahavi emphasizes that kinesthesia is not only and first of all a feeling of movement, but of experiencing my body movements. So here. This pre-reflective feeling of movement is then fundamental for a certain awareness of being the agent of this moving body, and accordingly, kinesthetic experiencing my body moving is fundamentally different to experiencing another person moving. It seems very sort of banal in a way, but this is sort of the very basic to their description. And they point to, I would say then in relatively different ways, that proprioception, or rather certain parts of proprioception, the feeling of my bodily positions, comes along with kinesthesis. As Typala emphasizes, and I quote, self-awareness in its essential materiality of being this body both involves a passive proprioceptive as well as an active kinesthetic awareness of movement. So they bring these two together. And here I want to stop a little bit because I mean this is how it is sort of how kinesthesis is defined and described, part of it in relation to embodiment, and just make a short stop and think about proprioception. Because as soon as you look into different kinds of practices, you would, for example, yoga, but it could also be other kinds of practices. So the whole thing about, standing here on your feet and just try to close your eyes and feel how is your weight sort of distributed on your soles. And then feel how is your tension on a knee. And then lose that tension and you'll feel that that does something to how the curve is in your lower back. Have any of you tried this kind of exercise? This is definitely proprioception and is present to my awareness. And I would think of that as an active part of proprioception. It also means that it refers here to the more passive part referred to the part which is in the body schema, following Sean Gallagher's work from 2005. And the more active part is what relates to what we could think of as relating to the body image. So just to keep that in mind. It's an absolutely central point in both the Harvis's and Typala's descriptions that kinesthesis contributes to our consciousness of perceptual reality in a radically different way than our tactile and visual perception. While in perception, we must distinguish between perception and the perceived, for example, the touching and the touched, and the seeing and the seen, kinesthesis is lived through, as Typala emphasizes. Kinesthesis is not a presenting sense, and a little bit later in his book, movement is known by itself. Kinesthesis thereby provides, in that idea, the perceptual circumstances for sensations of any kind. It co-emerges with perception, and perception and kinesthesis are to be considered reciprocal dependent or intimately united. And then I should also add that what is really sort of emphasized is in their work is that the temporal continuity of perception is provided through kinesthesis. And of course, you should think of kinesthesis as a feeling of undergoing perceptions. Now, further, they emphasize, both of them, that kinesthesis should not then, as a next step, be misinterpreted as a special kind of interoception. Like, for example, sensing one's heart beating when running, or one's breast expanding while taking a deep breath. In both these two examples, we can identify what is perceived and related to the heart pumping and the breast case changing shape. We can distinguish between the interoception and the interoceptive. Just as well as if I go to the active part of proprioception, we could think about how we sort of related to the tension in the knee joints. So, and then Typala, and that's actually in a note, but I think it's quite important. The tricky thing, according to Typala, is that these interoceptions and active proprioceptions that I just addressed here are at the same time also kinesthetically present to us. The heart beating, the breast expanding, and the tension in the knee joint also kinesthetically feels to us. So, and that is what comes to this. I mean, kinesthesis is this feeling of undergoing perception that should not be misunderstood as interoception. Okay, fine. This is about some of the stuff that they describe here, and then they continue to emphasize that it's not sort of closed off from the world, no, from our awareness. So it means that it is present to our awareness, and Sahami especially talk about kinesthetic awareness, which sort of comes with our habitual movements, and then we can be more invested in what we're doing. The example is standing on a diving board, and then there will be a certain kinesthetic effort at stake. So the whole thing is, again, that we should not think of kinesthesis as absent from our awareness in an absolute sense. It is present, but it is as this sort of supporting our perceptual engagement. Further, in that sense, it's also drawn to the world in the way we are touched by objects, environments, and others. That comes with the perceptual sort of other side. Now, I mean, so this comes, gets closer to my question. So how can it help us to understand how we feel movement? But at the same time, thinking of kinesthetic awareness and kinesthetic effort, like there are nuances that I would generate through it as an interview with a ballet dancer, describing how she sort of feel movement dancing less feet, which kind of is, there's a lot more to it. And if you talk to a tango dancer, or if you talk to, a person sort of engaged in a mosh pit, I mean, and there would be very different things at stake here. So what is the next step? How do I activate it in relation to these kinds of activity? And let me see here. I think I'll jump, maybe go back here, but I've looked into also feminist phenomenologist Al-Sajis, her work on kinesthesis, which to a large degree resonates with both Harvis's and Type's descriptions. But she also pushes things a little bit further. So kinesthetic experiencing, according to Al-Sajis, is a function of my body's orientation in the world. It's not just a being. It's my way of feeling the active engagement of my body with an outside. And she continues to emphasize that the feeling of kinesthetic effort and kinesthetic awareness in my reading of her work in perception reflect our world involvement. And what she specifically discusses here, and you could maybe imagine that with a feministic sort of approach, is also that it's not just about how we bump into tables or see tables and objects and environments. It's also about social power that can be at stake here in this understanding of reflecting our world involvement. And that sort of gives another active sense of, being in a dynamic exchange with the world. Yeah. That should go here. So just to sum up what I've presented now on embodiment and kinesthesis. Kinesthesis provides the perceptual circumstances for sensations of any kind, and that involves interoception, active proprioception, and exteroception of different kinds, visions, touching. Kinesthesis is felt, and we can distinguish between if we are moved or pushed or to move or initiating movement ourselves. It's sort of very basic to it. And then there is this suggestion of distinguishing between kinesthetic awareness and kinesthetic effort. We should think maybe on sort of more or less, and adding sort of Al-Sajis to this equation. We could think of the lived body as a network of being in touch with the world. And this network is in configuration in a more sort of labeled sense in her work of it. I'm still sort of thinking of how far I would go here, but there are body sort of information in her work. And just I want to add one last thing, which is have been implicit to my descriptions here, that we need to think of kinesthesis then as intermodal. So it works between sort of modalities, sense modalities that sort of support self-perception, just to keep that in mind. That far so good. Let's look into sort of ethnographical fieldwork a little more. I mean, how do we get from kinesthesis to actually sort of describe what people feel in movement, feel while they move, qualitative movement? That was badly formulated. How do they feel? That was just what I wanted to say. And I want to suggest in this last part of my presentation the concept of kinesthetic sensibilities. So just once again, how does this cultivation of embodiment take place, perceptual attunement, and how do we think of feeling movement in that diversities of practices that can be at stake? I have to mention here there is one philosopher who I'm not sort of touched on right now, and she has been into movement, and that is Maxine Sheets-Johnstone. So I want to touch a little bit on her work here now, and also that sort of let you know why I don't go move further into work. She has, Maxine Sheets-Johnstone, insistently argued that we ought to pay much more attention to the fact that we come into the world moving. And I can just say, great, yes. And in several of her works, but at the same time, because in several of her works, she harshly criticizes, especially Merleau-Ponty, as well as several contemporary philosophers, and I would say especially Dan Zahavi and John Gallagher. And these are the guys I sort of build on here, right? And she criticizes them for their occlusion of kinesthesia. She addresses their approach as an adult perspective, that is from her 2019 article, end quote, and indicates that they only touch relatively briefly on Husserl's detailed description of the twofold articulation of perception and movement. And she further emphasizes that they are missing out on the, quote, the spatio-temporal energetic dynamics of movement, dynamics that precisely constitute the qualitative dynamics, whether a matter of self-movement or the movement of human and non-human animals and objects in the world, end quote. So see, and I mean, to put it short, she's really after the whole concept of embodiment here, saying we should think of the body and movement and embodiment, on the wrong track. So I mean, that is kind of say I work with embodiment because I work with the ethnographical approach and how these bodies have been sort of shaped and lived and living bodies. So I have a hard time sort of dealing with that, and that could be kind of end of the story. But I'll give some critical remarks, which is maybe a little more from a dance philosophical approach. So also add to that. And also thereby from a more ethnographical perspective, say, I have a hard time recognizing some of the stuff that Maxine Sheets-Johnstone is sort of claiming here. That is what she wants us to, always involving the quality dynamics of a movement as they are felt kinesthetically. Now, the thing that is really important in her work is that the way she connects this the distinctive spatio-temporal dynamics that are constantly created in movement. That is in her work directly 10 minutes back, nice, and should fit. That is directly connected to kinesthesis. And also she addresses it as kinesthesia, just to be correct, according to her work. And she would then also say that we can turn to kinesthesia by leaving, sort of turning away from exteroception to really, for example, close your eyes and just do an arm stretch and really feel how there's this kind of inherent dynamic in the movement. So the kinesthesia she's talking about is directly sort of connected to a certain feeling of movement as described by this spatio-temporal dynamic. And there is several problems here. I've already, together with Ravn, pointed to that. I mean, sort of trying to close off exteroceptive perception does not mean that you close off from the world. You're still a lived body. So you're still perceptually attuned to the world, even if you have closed eyes or not. So the world is still there, also in the way you lived your body. And further, the reference to dance and dances and improvisation in her work also, if you look into how that is described and then try to go into the literature and dance scholarly research, it hardly reflects the actual diversity and the different kinds of practices that are described and analyzed when we, for example, talk about improvisation. I mean, she addresses improvisation that and that is an important way of sort of further elaborating on kinesthesis in ways that does not really reflect, so it reflects a certain practice, but it doesn't reflect all kinds of dance practice. So she's also, maybe I have a hard time sort of writing it in an article, but in an informal conversation, I might be tempted to say she seems to reflect her own dance experience and also thereby reflecting her own sort of ideal of dancing and herself being part of a certain period in American contemporary dance practice. And that's the practice you reflect in her idea of dancing. And that creates problems if you want to sort of develop a phenomenological framework where we can also engage it in that, so in the analysis of other kind of movement praxis, which is what I'm aiming for. Now it's worth, I think, just stopping up a little bit and think of somatic practices, which is this umbrella term for activities where you in different ways turn to the body itself. And this is exactly what she wants us to do, to explore this felt movement of the body. And I just want to mention quickly, because I think it is a super interesting study and with so much work. It's Dorian George, who performed ethnographical fieldwork combined also with historical material over 3 decades on 3 selected somatic practices, specifically in an American context. What he shows there through really sort of robust data is that turning to the body itself as a source of knowledge, which is at stake in somatic practices, come to rely on ideas of a universal body dancing. He also points to that it tends to be a white male body dancing that is kind of the universal body dancing here. This does not, I just want to say right away that I don't here thereby criticize the value and the richness of somatic practices. I think it's great, but I think there's a problem if you sort of address it as if it give you, access to a certain kind of knowledge that cannot be sort of found anywhere else. That in itself is a theoretical problem, analytical and theoretical problem. And further, he shows very convincingly that these practices are not aesthetically nor culturally neutral. And then I have to speed up a little bit because I want to suggest now kinesthetic sensibilities. So I'm building now on kinesthesis as presented with embodiment. Now I just say this is why I'm not touching on kinesthesia as presented by Maxine Sheets-Johnstone. I want to look into kinesthetic sensibilities. And I have that concept from Philippa Waldfield's Dance Philosophers, her work from 2021. And she defines it as the dancer's perceptual disposition towards movement. In her work, she addresses, or she says that she wants to activate Thomas Sordis, and Thomas Sordis is a phenomenological anthropologist. She wants to activate his account of somatic mode of attention. And what goes into Sordis's somatic mode of attention is an emphasis of the fact, according to Sordis, that neither attending to nor attending with the body can be taken for granted, but must be formulated as culturally constituted. I can't take it. Constituted somatic mode of attention. Maybe I should take some more in here. Yeah. So she builds on that. So there's more to say about Sordis, and it is primarily an anthropological approach where he builds specifically on Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology. I want to connect it, so I'm pushing it further, the concept that Waldfield presents here. I suggest that kinesthetic sensibilities can connect to the phenomenological description of embodiment, that the concept can indicate that kinesthetic awareness or effort, more or less, can be drawn to the world in active ways, depending on the interactive dynamics, of course. So it also means that if we say that it sort of comes with perception, and there's this perceptual attunement going on according to the interactive dynamics of the activity, then there will also be this kind of attunement of how feeling of movement comes sort of is addressed and felt in this activity. Let's just how much time do I have back?
3 minutes.
3 minutes? Okay, I have time for this. So I just want to stop a little bit and because what happens if we try to look at different kinds of ethnographical data or on what dancers actually say about feeling their body moving and how do they perceive their body? I mean, do we know anything about that connection? And well, that's my own work here because we actually did that article in 2009, where I did a field work with 13 different dancers over 17 months to look at different ways of approaching the body, different kinds of dance techniques, different ways of perceiving the body. And what the dancers describe in different ways, depending on the style, is that the body perceived is at the same time also the body felt. It also expresses that aspect. That means their feeling of movement. So for example, one of the contemporary dancers, this is just one example. I have almost the rhythm of like perceiving outside, perceiving internal, perceiving outside, perceiving internal. So there's a constant flow of flux of sort of being out in. That is his description. And it was a male dancer. And in general, dancers refer to how they may focus on how the initiation of movement or a certain release of muscle tension takes a visual form in the actual movement execution. That's kind of the perceptual aspect of it. And at the same time, they will also address this sort of a certain feeling of movement, close relation to that. So there is sort of, if you look into ethnographical data, I can support this way of approaching it. In conclusion, this is 2 slides. I'm allowed. Okay. So this is more like maybe a little more like a summary. Kinesthesis is first as a strong argument for me is not right there to be explored when turning away from exteroception. So I argue against the sort of the suggestion that Maxine Sheets-Johnstone has brought up. Kinesthesis works in an intermodal way. Perceptions become attuned in and through the interactive dynamics of the movement praxis. And then I continue. I suggest to use the notion kinesthetic sensibilities on the ground of what was shown in the former slide to address specific ways in which the feeling of one's movement reflect that it co-emerges with a perceptual attunement and cultivation of embodiment. One consequence, we cannot measure nor compare kinesthetic sensibilities across, for example, Argentinian tango, Aikido, solo creation, or the mosh pit, as if the practitioner's feeling of the movement can be described by using a universal scale of dynamic qualities. Rather, we have to sort of go into the perceptual attunement and go with that and describe it on the condition of the interactive dynamics. Okay, 45 minutes. Thank you.